part of the Earglue Media family of podcasts.
You're listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies.
Welcome to Petticoats and Poppies, History Girls at the Movies. We're your hosts, Maggie and
Nicole. And we are so excited to be back today with another episode as Dev Patel's summer continues.
But before we get into today's episode with another Dev Patel film, we wanted to talk about some of the other things we've been watching lately. Obviously, we've both watched The Green Knight and The Personal History of David Copperfield, but what else have you been listening to?
So I've watched several things that I would not recommend, so I'm not going to bother talking about those. This is always that time of the year where, for film critics, you see a lot of things that studios are putting out now to save their better movies for closer to awards season, I feel like.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been brutal out there. But I've also watched some things that I really did like. In terms of non-period dramas, I watched the film Together, which is a movie made for the BBC. It aired in the UK, I think back in like June, but it's finally out now in the US. And it is about a couple and their young son in lockdown. And it's got James McAvoy. And it's a really unique piece. There's a lot of breaking of the fourth wall. It almost sort of feels like a YouTube vlog or something with how much they address the camera.
Mm-hmm.
But it helped me process things that have gone on in the past 18 months that I didn't even realize I hadn't processed. So that was, it was a very cathartic movie for me. And I think for anyone else who sort of has had a hard time in lockdown, sort of dealing with their feelings about other people, dealing with if anyone else has lost someone to COVID, hopefully you could watch it and it be as cathartic for you as it was for me. The other non-period drama that I want to talk about is the movie Annette.
Which Nicole wrote a lovely review that's up over at Your Money Geek.
Thank you. I did. It's a really weird movie, and it's a very strange movie to try to recommend to people. There've only been two people I've recommended it to wholeheartedly, and that's because I knew that their tastes align with mine enough. And even one of those people, I was like, you should watch it, but if you don't like it, that's fine. I think that you will, but if you don't, I understand why. It's the most unique movie musical I've ever seen. Adam Driver is incredible in it. So is Marion Cotillard. So is Simon Helberg. I've been listening to the album nonstop. I literally just walk around my townhouse quoting the way that Adam Driver sings Baby Annette, Baby Annette. And I'm obsessed with it. It's in one of my top movies of the year right now. So if you like really weird kind of out there things, then I definitely recommend it. If on the off chance that anyone listening has any familiarity with the musical The Grinning Man, kind of reminds me of that. Also uses puppets, and there's this very specific type of puppet that I really love, and then I hate all other puppets, and this is the type that I love. So a very me film.
Which style? I'm a puppeteer, so I'm curious to know.
I don't actually.
Is it Banruku?
I don't know what they're called. I don't like. It's a specific aesthetic of puppet that I'm good with.
I'll have to look it up because now I'm curious.
Yeah, I think Maggie, I actually think you should watch it. It's on Amazon Prime.
I plan to. I just have been so swamped. That's definitely on the top of my list.
I get that. I totally get that. That's me with respect, which I feel like you're probably going to talk about later. But
yes,
in terms of period dramas, I want to talk about one movie and then one TV miniseries. I watched to review the movie Last Letter from Your Lover, which is based on the book of the same name, which is on Netflix. Maggie and I both have a special interest in this movie because Joe Alwyn is in it.
Yes.
And I love Joe Alwyn, but it also has Caleb Turner, who was in the new Emma movie as Frank Churchill, which is our first podcast episode. So I got to tie it back to that. But it's a really interesting sort of dual timeline story. You've got Felicity Jones in the modern day, looking into these letters from back in the, I think the early 50s maybe. And I can't remember if it's 50s or 60s. It's been a It's been a few weeks. But I really enjoyed it. It's a really nice, just sort of romantic drama. And it's on Netflix, so definitely check it out. I know like my mom also loved it. Everyone I've talked to whose mom has watched it, their mom loved it. So if you're looking for a movie like to watch with your mom, that's a good one. And there's also like nothing in it content-wise that you couldn't watch with your mother.
Somebody needs to start a blog
Yeah.
that's like movies to watch with your mom. Let's do this.
Maybe we
Let's
should do
make it a list of these things and just like revisit it. I think we could make a ton of people happy.
I think we could
It's
too.
like the does the dog die? Can I
was
watch
literally
this
thinking,
with my mom?
it's like, does the dog die? Can I watch this with my mom? Yeah. And then the last thing I want to talk about is a BBC, once again, a BBC miniseries thing that we finally got here in the US recently, and that's The Pursuit of Love. It's, I think, just 3 episodes of an hour each. It's very short. Like, I sat down and watched it all in one go, and I'm not someone who ever binge watches things, but it's got a phenomenal cast. Andrew Scott is fantastic in like a supporting role, and Lily James is as good as ever in the lead. The whole cast though was really great. It's got Dominic West. It's got I'm trying to think, Emily Mortimer. Is that? Yeah, Emily Mortimer. I think I've got that right. Is also the director of it. It's her like directing debut, and I think she wrote the script as well. But it's a really interesting look at sort of English upper society. It definitely is like kind of satirical of the English upper classes in the pre-war and the early war years of World War II. And I really enjoyed it. It's, again, a bit different, stylistically really fun. And I definitely would recommend it. Again, like I said, too, it's like pretty short. So I would definitely recommend that one. And it's on Prime. So you can watch it for free if you've got Amazon Prime. So what about you, Maggie? Other than the one that I like spoiled that I know that you've seen.
So out of all of the movies that I have seen so far this year, the most unexpected for me was The Protégé. Which I saw last week. I went into that having really no idea what I was getting into outside of the fact that Michael Keaton was in it and Maggie Q. So like naturally I was excited because like I really love Michael Keaton and I really love Maggie Q. And honestly, I walked out of that film and I was like, I have not been this willing to be obsessed with something of this nature since Vesper and James in James Bond. And that really makes sense because the film was directed by Martin Campbell, who brought James Bond back to us all those years ago. And I just really love this film. Like I am like fully prepared to like take on the marketing for this movie. Like I had such an unexpectedly good like time. I think that in an era where we have like tons of these like assassin movies, like Mission Impossible and John Wick and like all these different ones that are like male-led, like badass films, that it was really refreshing to have one that centered around Maggie's character, Anna, who was the badass assassin. And she was just so amazing. And it had this really great like enemies to lovers kind of vibe going on. Between Anna and Rembrandt, which I was not expecting, and it was fantastic. And I cannot quote the dialogue between them because it is very much R-rated, but some really fantastic dialogue that like you just don't expect to hear Batman saying. But the whole movie was so great, and actually I saw that with my mom. Who was the person who introduced me to my love for Michael Keaton. So it was like perfect. And I really enjoyed it. And I am really happy about the fact that the Twitter account for it liked my review and a bunch of subsequent tweets about it. So yeah, me and the Lionsgate marketing BFFs.
Love this for you.
But really, I have to say, in terms of like PR companies or like the PR parts of studios, Lionsgate has been like freaking amazing. I have loved working with them on different projects to get like screeners and stuff, and they've been really chill and awesome. Really enjoyed that screening. But like I saw the Suicide Squad, which I'm not as much of a fan as I thought I was going to be of that. It took me like 2 days to watch it. I watched the first 13 minutes and was more willing to go watch Saw again, because it was like really gory in the first 13 minutes, and like it just, I couldn't do it, which is not usually a me thing. But then I also saw Respect, which you spoiled. And I really enjoyed Respect. I came out of that film with new respect.
Okay.
And
which I will say for anyone listening, they just announced, I want to say like today or yesterday, that it is going to VOD soon.
Excellent.
Like in,
I'm so glad.
Next week or something. So that if you can't go see it in the theater, you'll be able to see it at home.
Good. It's so good. Jennifer Hudson is incredible and she deserves all of the awards. I think she's an extremely talented actress, and I don't think people have given her enough credit for her ability to act. She really hasn't done a lot of like strictly acting stuff. Like, yeah, she was in like a random couple scenes of like the Sex and the City movie, and she was in Dreamgirls and Cats.
She really hasn't done anything big acting wise, I think, since Dreamgirls.
And she's really good.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really hoping that this gets her back into the limelight a bit more and we see her more. Also, I am currently watching my screener for the documentary about LuLaRich. I love a good documentary. It's from the same documentary team that did the Fire Fest documentary a couple of years ago and a couple other big kind of like explosive documentaries. First episode was absolutely wild. I never got into LuLaRoe, but I know a lot of people who succumbed to the lure of the pyramid scheme. And it's just really fun to kind of watch it and how it like all unraveled. So it's super fun. That comes out like September 9th, I think. And then I'm also listening to an audio drama, which I think is my first audio drama that I've ever listened to. And it is the Star Wars Tempest Runner, which comes out next week. And it's like listening to a movie. Like if you've never listened to an audio drama before, like I think that more people should get into listening to audio dramas because it's very fun. But yeah, I thought I was going to be watching a lot more movies here coming up because of TIFF, but things are not good for US-based digital attendees. But I'm still trying to figure out which movies I can watch. I'm hoping to get Benediction. That's one that I really wanted to see.
Oh my god, that's like, I think out of everything at TIFF, that's the thing I'm most excited about.
Benediction and Belfast were the two movies I really wanted to see.
Okay, wait, I'm an idiot. Belfast is my number one.
Yeah, but that one's not streaming digitally, so I cannot see that one. But Benediction has a limited screening, and so I actually reached out to the people in charge of like publicity for the film to see if I could get on, and they said I was on the list, so we'll see if I actually get in, because that was definitely one. But there's a couple Irish films that I think are streaming for US attendees, like I Am Not Your Mother, and a couple of really interesting queer films actually, which I'm interested to see. Like I think both of the Irish films also have queer themes, so I'm curious to see how they handle those because they seem to be darker movies as well. But yeah, I'm excited about this slate of movies coming out. I feel like I'm going to be talking about a lot of movies the next time we record an episode of this.
Yeah, definitely.
The movie we're talking about today is The Personal History of David Copperfield.
It is. So this movie had its world premiere at TIFF in 2019, and it was released in the UK in January 2020, and then it felt like we never got it here. And it didn't come out in the US until August of 2020. I know for me, like it got a theatrical release, but I wasn't going to theaters at that point. I don't think most of them were open around me.
No, there was like a very limited.
Right? I just never ended up watching it last year, which is, it's weird. Like I literally was talking to someone earlier and he was like, oh yeah, I literally meant to see that and then like forgot. And I was like, same. But it does exist out in the world. You can watch it. It is based on, of course, Charles Dickens's David Copperfield, and it's adapted by Simon Blackwell and, oh god, Maggie, I'm gonna butcher this name, Armando Iannucci.
Yeah.
We're gonna stick with that. It was directed by Armando Iannucci, and it stars Dev Patel with this list of names. Lord help me. Aneurin Bernard? Peter Capaldi. Do we think is it Morfydd? That feels too easy.
It's a very Welsh name.
Right? I'm like, I don't trust myself to pronounce anything Welsh. But Morfydd Clark, Daisy May Cooper, Rosalind Elysia, Hugh Laurie, Tilda Swinton, Ben Whishaw, Paul Whitehouse, and Benedict Wong, Gwendolyn Christie. Literally, the list of people just goes on and on and on. Like everyone. Anna Maxwell Martin is in this movie very briefly. Like everyone is in this. And I think that David Copperfield is interesting in that it is said to be Dickens' favorite of his novels, and it's also said to be somewhat autobiographical. It definitely is the novel in which we see the most of sort of Charles Dickens, the person. And David Copperfield definitely is sort of a stand-in character for Charles Dickens in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
So, as I said, this cast is insane. Poor Ben Whishaw, like, what did they do to you in
Truly.
this film? Poor guy. Also, I was very excited whenever Fizio Akanade showed up, because I know him from whenever I was at the Donmar Warehouse. He was in a show while I was there, and he's the loveliest guy. So whenever he showed up on screen, I was like, oh my God. But my main takeaway from this is mostly just like Dev Patel for every period drama ever, please.
Truly,
Which
yes,
I guess
please.
like that's the whole theme of this month on Petticoats and Poppies, is that we would like to see Dev Patel in every period drama. But I also just want to say I would love to fly a kite with Dev Patel. That's like my other main takeaway from this movie. I'd love to like frolic across a field with Dev Patel.
Let's go fly a kite.
Me too, Dev Patel. But as you know, Maggie, I love a period drama with a diverse cast.
Yes.
And I really like how playful this movie is. I think that works really well for like a Dickens novel. I think that people often don't realize like how funny Charles Dickens was and how witty. I love like in some of the early shots that are like from his childhood, there's like they're like from the perspective of a child, like sort of looking up. I love all the bright colors and the use of patterns and the costuming. I think I read a lot of stuff because this costuming did get some mentions at like Guild Awards and stuff. And they talked a lot about the idea is that they were matching a lot of things together that wouldn't have been worn together. But everything that we see is generally, which I'm sure you'll get into this later, but generally period accurate. It's just put together in ways that aren't necessarily, you know, people weren't necessarily wearing like 4 patterns at a time. But I love that they are in this. Also, Maggie, I don't know if this like sent you to, but it sent me when I forget the character's name, but when he tells David Copperfield, I shall call you Daisy.
Yes.
I was like, is this Greta Gerwig's Little Women?
Yes. Plot twist. This is actually a Little Women prequel.
Yeah. Meg March and David Copperfield, same character.
Yes, actually.
I really love the part where he's like in love with Dora and he's walking around town and he's seeing like her name everywhere, like it's in the clouds and it's on the signs. And I was like, this is so cute. And I think that it's really interesting in that like we see a lot in the character of David Copperfield, like his tension about money, like the scene where they come to tell him that they're now poor, essentially, again. And he's so worried. He's like, you don't understand what this means, like all this stuff. And I think that we're really seeing there like Dickens' thoughts, because Charles Dickens was very afraid of sort of returning to the poverty that he'd spent his young years in. For anyone listening who doesn't know I talked about this back whenever we did our episode at Christmas time on The Man Who Invented Christmas, but I volunteered at the Charles Dickens Museum in London for a year. That's why I tend to talk about Charles Dickens like he's someone that I like know or something. And more on that later. For all that I appreciate in this movie, I can't entirely figure out why I didn't like it more. I think part of it
feel the same way.
Yeah, part of it is I do think it feels like there's never really any real emotional stakes to it. It's not quite played fantastical enough to be like fully just like an absurdist comedy, but like even when bad things happen, it never feels that bad. And I'm not like, I don't think it's the performances per se, and like everybody in the cast is good, but nobody's great because I don't think they have the material to be. And like even like with the romance, I felt like I knew from the very beginning, even without really remembering the story of David Copperfield that well, who he was going to end up with, where it was going to go. So there was never any real tension. Although there were a few times where I felt for, oh my God, what is her name? The other girl, not Dora, but is it Agnes? Agnes?
Yeah,
when
Agnes.
he's like, when he tells her that she's like a sister to him, I was like, oh girl, I feel you. Ouch. But yeah, I wanted to like this movie more than I did. But alas, and I think if you've got a period drama with a cast like this, and even I'm a little bored, something has gone wrong.
Truly. Yeah, this cast was incredible, but I thought it was hilarious that this is yet another film where Dev Patel walks through beautiful scenery and gets robbed.
It's our favorite genre.
This is a new genre of films, and I'm very into it. But yeah, this cast is just like absolutely insane. I was like, Dev, Peter Capaldi, Hugh Laurie, Tilda Swinton, Gwendolyn Christie, and Aaron Barnard. I always say his name wrong. Too many R's. But I was like, this is like incredible. Gorgeous color design inside of like all of the houses. I thought the designs were like absolutely gorgeous. I found that a lot of the story had been consolidated, which I think is interesting, but also like necessary when you're trying to make a Dickens book palatable to a modern and wider audience, because he does have a tendency to drag a bit, but in like a good way. I say that as a fan of Dickens. I felt like the film worked overall quite well, actually. Probably one of the better adaptations. But there were like some stylistic choices that didn't mesh well for me. I actually texted Nicole like after I was like halfway through it. I was probably 3/4 through it when I texted you. And like the back half of the film really dragged for me. And it was actually when they introduced like the romance plots that I kind of, I don't want to say I lost interest in it because I didn't lose interest in it. I watched the whole thing, but like I found myself less invested in the story that was playing out on my screen. And I think it was because those romances didn't have as like true stakes involved in them. Like you were saying, like I was kind of fuzzy on who he ended up with. I was like, does he end up with her or her? I was like, I think it's her. And I don't know what it was. It just felt really disconnected. Like there was no emotion in it. And at times I felt like they didn't have a clear idea of what the plot of the film was. Like so much of the focus went into creating this like really beautiful spectacle, and like the scenery and the clothing and like the cinematography, all of which were gorgeous. But I was like, I don't actually know what the plot is. Like, where is the A, B, and C of the story? Which is unfortunate because like this cast was so incredible, and I just didn't think they had a lot to truly work with. But I did like how they used visual gimmicks, for lack of a better word, to propel parts of the story. Like when the carriage comes to pick him up, that transition was like fantastic. And I really loved all the stuff when he was a child. I felt like the big hand reaching in to grab stuff, and like a lot of the stuff they played with kind of reminded me of The Man Who Invented Christmas. And some of those more like larger than life story aesthetic details that they used to capture that essence of, you know, David Copperfield telling the story of his childhood. And I liked how that was employed, and I thought that worked really well. And I kind of wish more of that was used throughout the rest of the film. There's just a lot of choices, but I do genuinely think that this is like a very solid adaptation that more people should watch. I would have given it like 7.5, 8 on a good day, in terms of like rating it, as a first-time viewer. And also as someone who really loves Dickens.
All right. So to start with, I just sort of wanted to lay down the history of David Copperfield adaptations because it's kind of funny. There were 6 play adaptations in 1849 when it was published originally. The first one, which was called Born with a Call, which was by George Almar, was actually written before the story was finished being serialized. So there are things in it that don't match the novel. Because they didn't even like wait for Dickens to finish it. Because for anyone who doesn't know, Dickens' works were always published serially in a magazine. So like piece by piece until they would finally be put together into the final novel. That's part of why he's so wordy. Because he was paid by the word.
I can relate.
Yeah, I'm like, I know any writer who is paid by the word is like,
I am paid by the word.
Yep. But there were 6 plays that year and 20 more in the 1850s. So it was very popular on stage. And Dickens himself, later in life, did dramatic readings from David Copperfield. Dickens was a very theatrical man, and this was one of his favorite things to do readings from. There have also been a lot of different radio adaptations of it. And in 2018, Richard Armitage did David Copperfield unabridged for Audible. So you
Can
can
I
go and
just say
check
that
that
is
out.
really good? I listened to that at the beginning of quarantine when I was like lonely and I needed like a voice to talk to me at night.
Okay. Maggie. No, I literally was going to ask you if you listened to it, and I liked it. I didn't even have to ask.
I love Richard Armitage, like
Do you
one of my
really?
favorite actors. Oh yeah, Robin Hood, 2007, Guy of Gisborne, Spooks, Vicar of Dilby. Like, yeah, no.
Love this for you. But in terms of movies, David Copperfield was adapted for the screen for the first time in 1911 by Theodore Martson, and there were actually 2 more silent films in 1913 and then 1922. There's a 1935 film directed by George Cukor with W.C. Fields. And then in 1956, and then again in 1966, there were 13-part TV series made. I don't know why 13 specifically both times, but in 1969, there was a Delbert Mann film made of it. And then in 1974, a 6-part TV series. There were animated films made, which I thought was interesting, in 1983 and 1993, again, 10 years apart. And in 1986, there was a BBC 10-part miniseries, and then in 1999, a BBC 2-part miniseries. But the last film was a made-for-TV film made in 2000, directed by Peter Medic, which had, get ready for this, Hugh Dancy, Sally Field, and Paul Bettany in it.
Okay, then.
I've not seen that version, but I feel like I need to now.
Yeah, we need to watch that.
Like, yeah, that is just the Paul Bettany simp in me saying that. But so this is actually the gap between 2019, 2020, whenever this film came out, in 2000, whenever that one came out, I believe is one of the largest gaps in time, like without a David Copperfield adaptation since they started making film adaptations of it back in 1911. We haven't gone that long without, I actually don't know that there's been a decade without a David Copperfield adaptation other than the 40s, which is understandable. We were all a little bit busy.
I can't imagine what was happening.
We were a little busy in the 40s, so I'll forgive it. So it's obviously something that gets adapted a lot. I don't think, though, there's ever been an adaptation that was like a super, I don't want to say a big deal, but that was like an awards contender or anything like that. There's no like definitive adaptation. So even though it's been on the screen a lot, there's not sort of any version that I think most people would compare it to, which is really a good opportunity for a director to come in and do it again and do it in this sort of inventive way. Obviously, it didn't really work out that well for them in terms of, I think partially because of when it got released. It just, a lot of people weren't going to theaters. Everything was bombing at the box office at the time. So obviously it didn't make a ton of money and then didn't end up really being in the Oscar consideration or anything. But I do think it's, interesting to think about when we'll get another David Copperfield adaptation, probably within the next 10 years.
Yeah. Now we're going to get into some history related to David Copperfield. I thought it would be fitting, not just because we're talking about Dickens, but because this is relevant to the story of David Copperfield, but to talk a little bit about workhouses. In the film, David is sent away to London to work at Murdstone and Grinby's wine bottle making factory, which was meant to parallel Dickens' own experience at the Boren's Blacking Factory, which was a boot polish factory that 12-year-old Charles Dickens was sent to work at. This employment was really just a step up from working in a workhouse, akin to where Oliver was kept in Oliver Twist. St. Luke's Workhouse, which is mentioned by name in David Copperfield, started its life in 1782, located near Hoxton in London. Today, it is known as Ashwell's Hall, and it is used for concerts and social events, and it is always soliciting donations to keep its doors open. So what were workhouses? Well, workhouses date back to the labor shortage after the Black Death wiped out much of the population of the United Kingdom. The Victorian era really revolutionized the workhouse, building around 150 new workhouses from 1840 to 1875, mainly throughout London, Lancashire, and Yorkshire. A common layout for the workhouses resembled Jeremy Bentham's prison panopticons, which I could talk about at length should anyone desire me to do that. I have written several papers on the panopticon and I am obsessed with it. And actually my first introduction to panopticons was from my Dickens class in my literature kind of foyer in college. So that felt very fitting to talk about that a little bit here. But I'm not going to get into it because I literally could wax philosophical about that and then start talking about Karl Marx. And that's not the podcast that you have come here for.
Actually, Maggie, I need you to not talk about Karl Marx because I had to read a bunch of Marx this past week for my class and I'm trying to forget it. So.
Oh, I love Karl Marx. I
like Marx. I just having to read a bunch of Marx for class was not my favorite experience.
Yes, I was radicalized by reading Karl Marx in college. You heard it here first, folks. But yeah, if you ever really want to get into like a deep dive into socialism, read Dickens. There is so much tie into it, especially with workhouses and debtors' prisons and all of the fun stuff that Nicole's going to get into in a little bit. But some of the key factors with workhouses, I wanted to consolidate this because I could literally talk about workhouses for extremely long period of time. But, you know, we are all ruled by hunger. Meals were not very exciting in workhouses, but they were nutritionally decent. Breakfast usually consisted of bread and gruel. Can I have some more, sir? Lunch was more. Lunch, which is what dinner, which is what we now know as lunch, might have consisted of cooked meats, pickled pork or bacon with some vegetables, potatoes, yeast dumplings, or soup, or suet. Do you know what suet is?
I feel like I've heard of suet, but I don't know what it is.
So we feed birds suet today. It's that the blocks of like seeds and fat that we put out for birds and like squirrels to eat. That's basically suet. Yes.
Yummy.
Very tasty.
Delicious.
And then supper usually consisted of bread, cheese, broth, and sometimes if you're really lucky, you'd get butter and potatoes. So the children were not working with a lot. So poor law unions opted to send destitute children to the British colonies. And from 1850 to 1871, one single farmhouse outside of London sent over 1,000 boys from workhouses to the colonies. So they ended up in Canada, they ended up in Australia, New Zealand, they ended up far abroad. Education was provided in workhouses, but I wouldn't really call it good education. Most often the teachers had grown up in workhouses or they had been brought in and they were not adequately equipped for educating. So you really weren't learning anything beyond your usefulness within the workhouse. Religion played a really big part in the workhouses, which is not surprising given the time period. Religion played a big part in a lot of the social causes, quote unquote, both in like debtors' prisons and workhouses and orphanages and all the different kind of functions of life that were set up to help the impoverished. There was also some interesting things. I did not take notes of this, of course, but there were programs in place to help people when they fell on hard times. And if those people failed to go work at the workhouse, they were not provided any sort of aid. It was not good. Workhouses were still a system in the UK up until April of 1930, when an act was enacted to make them go out of fashion. I'm certain that there are probably a lot of people who would love workhouses to come back because, you know, what says social progress like sending children to work in extremely dangerous, high stress, horrible conditions, buildings where everybody can see you, but you can't see them.
Love that.
Really some fun stuff. So you did some research on poorhouses, which is kind of another... Workhouses kind of fed into poorhouses, and poorhouses fed into workhouses. So I'm curious to know what you found.
Right. So it's interesting because the line is like a little bit vague. But I was specifically looking at debtors' prisons because that's sort of a topic that comes up in David Copperfield. And I specifically was looking at it also through the lens of John Dickens. Because as Maggie mentioned earlier, Charles Dickens went to work in a blacking factory as a young boy, and that's because his father, John Dickens, was sent to the Marshalsea debtors' prison in Southwark, London in 1824. And he was joined by his wife and his youngest children, but Charles was sent out to work at the age of 12. John Dickens owed a baker £40, which in today's money would be about £3,500. And John and his family were luckily only there for a few months, but Charles often went to the prison to eat breakfast and dinner with his family. An interesting thing about debtors' prisons is that visitors could actually like come and go pretty freely during the day. And a lot of people's families came and lived with them because there was just sort of a time in the evening where the people would say like, okay, everybody out who's leaving for the night, and everybody else had to stay in overnight if you didn't leave. It's a very different system to what we think of today, but it's obviously partially because debtors' prisons held people who owed money to a creditor of some sort. So they generally weren't considered dangerous people because, in a lot of debtors' prisons, they were just with people who were other debtors and not with petty criminals or anything like that. But the descriptions of prisons in the Pickwick Papers and Little Dorrit and David Copperfield are said to be extremely accurate to the period, and actually one of the best sources if you're looking to learn about prisons in the Victorian era. And obviously that comes from the fact that like Charles himself spent time at the Marshalsea prison. Debtors' prisons are a very complicated concept, so I just decided I was going to look just specifically at English debtors' prisons in the Victorian period. But 10,000 people were imprisoned for debt a year in England during the 18th and 19th centuries. That's a lot of people. For a long time, about half of the people in prison in England were there for debt. And in some of these prisons, like you could, if you had money, obviously not enough money to get out, but if you had some money, you could pay to do business, to receive visitors, to even sometimes like live a short distance away from the prison, and to have a better room. But in England, one thing that's unique as opposed to other places in Europe where there's sort of a set amount of time that you could be in prison for debt, in England, you were in prison until your creditor was satisfied, whatever that meant. So there were people who would spend like decades in a debtor's prison. And you had to pay your keep there, which I think is interesting. Like you had to pay for your room and your food, even though obviously you're in debt, so you don't have money. Yeah, like that to me feels very like oxymoronic. But hey, who am I to say how a Victorian prison should be run? Speaking of how a Victorian prison should be run, though, the Debtors Act of 1869 changed things. They made it a lot more difficult to send people to debtors' prison. However, you still could be sent if you could pay your debt and chose not to. So it became a thing where, like, if it was truly that you didn't have the money, that was sort of treated differently than if you were just choosing to run up your debts and not pay them. Which, fair enough, I guess. But so London had a bunch of debtors' prisons. It had Clink Prison, which is where, if you've ever heard the term in the clink to mean in jail, that's where it comes from. The Clink Prison in London. Coldbath
Lovely
Fields
place.
Prison.
Lovely
Yeah.
place. I love that.
Yep.
That's actually like my favorite patch of the Thames.
Love that
Not
for
kidding.
you.
I love that.
Fleet Prison, Giltspur Street Compter, King's Bench Prison, the Marshalsea Prison, Poultry Compter, and Wood Street Compter. So sometimes debtors' prisons were also workhouses, but not always. It's like a weird thing there, kind of, guys, I guess.
So much weird overlap with all of these different weird...
There really is. There really is. But there was some prison reform in the 1860s to try and make them like a safer place for people and less like licentious and everything. But the Marshalsea prison where John Dickens was imprisoned was notorious. It held mostly debtors, but also those accused of sedition and of crimes at sea, which I thought was interesting. The first prison on the site was actually built in the 14th century, but eventually it became sort of derelict and they tore it down. And a second Marshalsea prison was built in 1811. And the previous one obviously was there for centuries. And like all English prisons of the time, up until the 19th century, it was run for profit. Which, as you might guess, there's all sorts of ethical issues around running a prison for profit. I'm going to leave that there and not get political on this podcast. But the second Marshalsea actually wasn't open for that long, but it is more famous in that period because of the fact that Charles Dickens' father was there, and so he wrote a lot about that prison, and we know a lot about it. It had two sections in it at that point, one for debtors and one for the Admiralty who were there under court-martial. But an act of parliament did close it in 1842 after about 31 years of being in use. And the prisoners were either sent to Bethlehem Mental Hospital, if they were mentally ill, or to the King's Bench prison. And I didn't find this in my research, but I do wonder how many of them had to be sent to the mental hospital for them to mention it as one of the two options. But my interesting fun fact is that in the Charles Dickens Museum in London, which is in like the Clerkenwell, Islington area of London, up in the like attic, which is presented as a nursery, we actually have one of the windows from the Marshalsea prison. People, when I volunteered there, would frequently ask me when it was installed and why Charles Dickens did that. And if Dickens was so like ashamed of his father having been to prison, why he put that in his house. And I had to inform them that he did not do that. That was added much, much, much later while the house was a museum. So that always kind of cracked me up. That was probably my favorite question to get asked. Other than how did people fit in the bathtub, which I never knew how to answer. It was not in my docent package for what to answer.
They were smaller and they just sat. They weren't lounging.
I was like, you just kind of crouch. Like, you don't have running water. The water's going to get cold if you stand there too long. Like, this is a middle-class household, not an upper-class household. But yeah, so it is a very interesting thing. Obviously, you can't, like, really go see the Marshalsea anymore, but you can see one of the like window grates from it in the Charles Dickens Museum, which is like a really astounding artifact to have of it. And I think that sometimes people don't appreciate enough the ways in which, like, not to like psychoanalyze him, but the ways in which Dickens' childhood and his father being in prison really influenced his work, which is very obviously the most apparent in David Copperfield.
And now on to my favorite topic, which is costumes.
I thought your favorite topic was Matt Damon, but...
No, and I wasn't going to mention him at all in this episode as a treat, and then you did it!
We've got a thing going now. We got to just keep it up.
Yes. So the costumes were designed by Susie Harmon and Robert Worley. Susie has worked on a wide variety of projects like Detective Pikachu, Vanity Fair, The Death of Stalin, and the upcoming film The Chevalier about Joseph Boulanger, Chevalier de Saint-Georges.
Our movie that we manifested.
We manifested this into reality. Robert has also worked on a number of films as an assistant costume designer and a puller, including films like Enola Holmes. He worked with Susie on Vanity Fair. He worked on the Grand Budapest Hotel, and he was a stock coordinator on Marie Antoinette, which I thought was a nice little connection between the two.
Oh, I love that. The
clothing styles presented in David Copperfield range from the 1930s to the 1940s, which fits the roundabout time period presented in the film. I think they were aiming for like late 1840s, because they did depict along the bridge there, the Parliament buildings being built. And that started in, I believe, 1839 and lasted for about 30 years. Also, when David Copperfield's father dies, I believe it says 1840 on the headstone. So like 1840s, and that makes sense. Like I've said in past episodes, unlike today, when fashions change, you didn't run to the store and buy a new outfit to match whatever the viscose kids were wearing. We did not have TikTok to dedicate our trends. So people wearing things in the 1930s and the 1940s, totally common. I just said the 1930s, 1830s and 1840s. It's because when we were talking about the 1940s earlier and like, why weren't they doing anything in the 1940s? Now I have that like ingrained in my brain.
I messed you up. I'm sorry.
It is okay. So in the clothing styles, the 1830s and 1840s. But there are a lot of contrast going on between David's happier moments as a child and even in adulthood, kind of contrasting with some of the darker moments. And I thought that was really interesting, especially like Gwendolyn Christie's outfit is like that very black, very dour, that kind of comes in as a dark cloud in David's life. And then there's some interesting kind of usages of that when he's at the bottle factory. And I just really like the contrast of colors, because so much of the second half of the film is like so bright, and it's like so much of the life and light comes back into his life once he starts to get his like own footing as a man, kind of beyond the station that he was being brought up into. As you mentioned earlier on, there's a lot of like conflicting patterns, which I think worked really well. So many of these bold looks were actually inspired by authentic pieces. In an interview with Medium, Susie Hartman said, "We researched daguerreotypes in the 1840s and specifically loved the American ones, as the way they would dress in the photographs would be a lot more eccentric and bold than the British ones, which suited our characters perfectly. With this, we were able to give the clothes a richer look and a more heightened sense of reality, which matched the feel of the film and the visuals." And I think that worked really well. Clashing patterns can somehow work so well on screen and yet does not work in real life. I also really liked Agnes Wickfield's clothes. She had some really gorgeous pieces. Despite her being in like the happier periods of David's life, a lot of her clothes were very muted, which I thought was interesting. And it was really great to see some of the contrast with like Tilda Swinton's Betsy, who has such like gorgeous, insane patterns on her clothes, and like the bright yellow. And there's just a lot going on for the costumes. And I think the costumes really helped sell some of the moments in the scene some moments in some of the scenes that like really weren't doing it for me in the movie. Which I think really goes to say that costumes can make an okay film that much better.
Absolutely. I also really like the contrast sort of between Agnes's clothes, which, like you said, are sort of more like muted, more grounded. They feel more realistic, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And then like Dora's very like flouncy dresses.
Very flighty, very flouncy.
Which I think speak very well to those characters and what they represent. And yeah, really, really beautiful costume work. But thank you guys so much for coming along with us on Dev Patel Summer. Let us know if you liked this sort of look at like a specific actor in two different period dramas, because obviously we could do more like this in the future. There's so many actors who sort of have gotten their footing like in period drama and are frequent players in period drama that we could do this for. So like, let us know if you like this and if you have suggestions for people that you'd like to see us talk about specifically.
Yes, we would love to hear from you on social media and to hear what you think of the personal history of David Copperfield.
You can find us on social media at HGATM Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find Maggie over at Maggie of the Town, and you can find me at Nicole Ackman 16.
You can listen to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, the Airglue Media website, and Audible. If you like what you hear, don't forget to leave us a rating over on Apple Podcasts or on Podchaser. Every few episodes, we'll be reading our reviews, so be sure to leave us one if you would like to be featured.
We'll be back soon with another episode as we continue to look at period films from a history and film perspective. Until then, stay safe and healthy, and have a good end to your summer.
You've been listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies. Ta-da!
Dun 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 dun.